ChatGPT will replace data analysts. At least that's what it seems like based on what everyone's saying about the introduction of the code interpreter. I've had access to it for the last month or so, and honestly, I haven't been that impressed. Before I talk about why I think the code interpreter is overrated, I should at least give it some credit. It's a solid advancement and it's useful in many different ways. It can do some pretty cool stuff with basic data, and it can be helpful for people with no exposure to coding. It allows multiple types of data to be uploaded, and it can be particularly handy when it comes to basic data cleaning with regular expressions and iterating on simple data visualizations. However, in my opinion, this is where the benefits really end. Don't get me wrong, I still think ChatGPT overall is revolutionary. I just don't think the code interpreter is as big a deal as people are making it out to be. As it stands now, the code interpreter has a lot of limitations that make working with it more difficult than what I believe to be a better alternative, which of course I'll talk about at the end of the video. The first challenge with the code interpreter is a pretty big one. I would argue most people would find this tool really useful for analyzing data. The problem is that most data is stored in databases, and something that ChatGPT doesn't really have access to is databases. My friend Luke talks a bit about this in his new video as well. Of course, you can extract your data from your database to upload it on ChatGPT, but there's a lot of overhead associated with this, and there might be some security concerns depending on where you work. Let's do a little hypothetical. Imagine you're a race car driver. Your team gives you a solid, consistent, older model car. We'll call it, I don't know, Python 3.8. Meanwhile, the newest supercars, Python 3.9, 3.10, 3.11, just rolled out with an awesome new feature called AutoFast. Now, Python 3.8 runs perfectly fine for most races, but without the AutoFast feature of the later versions of Python, you just can't hit the ultra high speeds on the straightaways. This mirrors how in coding, while Python 3.8 is great for many applications, for some specific functions like auto speed, you'll need to be updated to some of the later versions. Obviously, this is also related to the code interpreter. To the best of my knowledge, it can only run Python version 3.8, while some libraries only work using later versions of Python. For example, I was experimenting with AutoGPT, and I believe that that only runs on Python 3.10. I was actually having issues with this earlier this week. Speaking of libraries, you also can't install new libraries in Python environments that exist in the code interpreter. That means there's plenty of tools that you really can't use. Now, OpenAI did do a decent job of including many useful packages for data analysis, but they definitely handcuff you if you want to explore new tools or libraries that are perhaps less commonly used. Here's a list of what's installed on the environment. It's robust, but again, definitely not exhaustive. Now, for the last pitfall of the code interpreter, let's go back to our car metaphor. Our code interpreter has a pretty hefty fuel tank, the RAM, and a strong engine, the CPU, which is good for a normal race. But for an intense next level race like machine learning, you need a turbo boost.
I need NOS. I need NOS.
While your car races fine without the turbo boost, you're missing out on some high-speed thrills. Specifically for the code interpreter, you're lacking a GPU, which for our car metaphor is the turbo boost. You really can't fully exploit machine learning capabilities without one of these. From what I can find, the interpreter instance has reasonably good compute. It seems like it has around 54 gigabytes of RAM and a processor with 16 cores, which it reluctantly told me. Again, not super sure how accurate this information is, but this is likely sufficient for most basic tasks. However, if a data analyst wanted to dip their toe into some deep learning, or a data scientist wanted to prototype some code, they might have to try some alternatives because of this lack of GPU. Surprisingly, I find the way that I was using ChatGPT to code before the code interpreter to be superior in a few different ways. Briefly, this is how I was using it before. So I'd read in data columns and describe them. I would then have ChatGPT generate code to analyze them based on the descriptions of the dataset that I put in. Next, I would put that code into Google Colab or run it locally, and I would debug by just copying and pasting the error messages that I'd get back into the ChatGPT window. While there are slightly more steps, I didn't find this process to be dramatically different than using the code interpreter. It's like choosing the scenic route over a highway drive. You have more control over the environment and way more interesting sights along the way. So yes, it's slower, but I had a lot more control over my environment, more flexibility in the tools that I could use, and access to significantly more different data sources. Again, this isn't to say that the code interpreter is bad. I think it's quite useful. I just don't think its ability to expand people's analytic capabilities aligns with all the hype surrounding it. I think a hybrid solution, where using the code interpreter and also another platform like Google Colab, is a superior short-term solution, at least until OpenAI makes tweaks to sort out the issues like the Python versioning, installing new libraries, and accessing databases. If you're interested in more details about how I use ChatGPT to increase my coding efficiency, try checking out this video next.